So, the Minecraft Dungeons Fauna Faire update recently dropped, and you know what that means?
All of my charts now are rubbish.
No, but seriously, they changed a lot of things with this update. There's a lot to unpack here. They affected weapons, they affected artifacts, they affected enchantments. It's just crazy. And yeah, a lot of my charts that included those weapons, they're now, well, obsolete and out of date. So I worked into the wee hours of the morning many nights in a row just trying to get everything recalculated and up to date, and I wanted to post this video just to keep you guys informed on what those changes were. Again, I'm not going over everything, I'm just going to be covering the weapons that were affected and how this affects things like, say, the stunning effectiveness on weapons, and how Voidstrike's boost is now calculated on some of the weapons. So, I'm going to try to include the images of this data on the screen here, but a lot of these images are big, so it's going to look like something made for ants. But I'm going to be providing links to Reddit posts that have these same images in the description down below so that you can read that in more detail at your leisure. Anyway, I want to start with probably the biggest hot button topic, Encrusted Anchor and, well, regular Anchor too, because they took a 15% hit in their damage, which a lot of people probably worried about because Anchor was a top weapon, at least for a lot of builds, and using conventionally against like single targets or some groups. I'd always said it wasn't the top weapon for groups. That was always like Cursed Axe or Double Axe or something, and for single targets you would want to do like Mechanized Saw Blade, but still, Encrusted Anchor was a pretty heavy hitter, so I think a lot of people are worried about that damage cut. So the way that I've been measuring these things in all of my charts beforehand were at 251 power, and measuring their DPS at plus 125% attack speed. That is if you're using a mushroom and, say, Renegade armor. That just seemed like standard, especially for calculating the Voidstrike boost, because that would be the minimum boost. And the reason why I'm doing it at 251 power is because, yeah, people have access to 263 gilded stuff now thanks to the tower, but you know, getting that god roll that you're looking for, or just getting every different type of gear at 263 power to see what their stats are, not exactly, you know, reasonable to expect everyone to do. So, I figure it's just easier to go by 251 power since that's a lot easier to accomplish. But if you want to see what their stats would be at 263, you could just take these numbers and increase them by 56.905%. It'll be basically in that range, give or take a few points. Anyway, yeah. The Anchor and Encrusted Anchor took a 15% hit to their damage, so originally it was 2,147,149, now it's 1,825,077. It's still pretty heavy hitting, it's just weird now what its damage is compared to, say, Starless Knight, because this is a hulking Anchor that you're swinging around. It should be hitting hard. For the DPS, it used to be, well, for Anchor it was 1,996,849, now it's 1,697,322, which, yeah, it's kind of a noticeable change, but again, the weapon gets a minimum 175% DPS boost from Voidstrike, so it still hits really hard. The one that took a bigger hit, though, actually was Encrusted Anchor, because originally it had 3,414,067 DPS, and 1.4 million of that was from poison. Now, though, it only has 972,236 poison DPS, with a total of 2,669,558, so that's a pretty big drop. Just like eyeballing it, it's like 31 to 33% less DPS. But again, keep in mind that with Voidstrike, it's still well over a 100% boost, and in fact, now that I think about it, big argument that I had for not, you know, fawning over Voidstrike on this weapon was because often the weapon killed in 1 or 2 hits anyway, so it made Voidstrike kind of pointless, because if you're killing on the second hit, then Voidstrike isn't doing anything to decrease the amount of hits that you need to kill a mob. But with this reduced damage per hit, it actually would help out now on more mobs than it did before. But yeah, the way that this affected its overall DPS was, it used to lead over beginning and the end as the best weapon, at least for conventional DPS, by almost double. Now it's barely above it, but I'll go over that a little bit later. The next weapon is an interesting one because in the patch notes it said that Bone Club, and I believe Bone Cudgel, got a 20% boost in damage. This is true for Bone Club, not for Bone Cudgel. They didn't touch that at all, so Bone Club originally had 1,295,958 damage on its final strongest hit. Now it's 1,556,683. So the DPS went from 2,447,751 to 2,938,910. which, yeah, I would say constitutes for the weapon jumping up a tier rating from, I think I had it to A tier now to S tier, but basically the damage that Bone Cudgel has against Illagers, Bone Club now has against every mob, so unironically it's better than Bone Cudgel. It's just weird how they messed that up. I'm pretty sure that they're gonna fix that later on, but yeah, for now, Bone Club is actually better than Bone Cudgel. Keeping up with the Flames of the Nether weapons, we have then the Broken Saw Blade and Mechanized Saw Blade. These ones were always interesting because conventionally they weren't that good, but if you use them very specifically, they were amazing, you know, against single targets. Originally, Broken Saw Blade had a combo of 14 to 15 hits, Mechanized Saw Blade had a combo of 23 to 24 hits, all those hits were 345,078 damage. If you were just holding the attack button down and letting the weapon overheat and then cool down, you would get 4 hits per second on Broken Saw Blade and 4.8 hits per second on Mechanized Saw Blade. Now, if you could artifact cancel perfectly whenever the overheat happened to bypass it, both of them would then have 6.7 hits per second, which, you know, on paper makes them both the same, but it does mean that you have to artifact cancel more often with Broken Saw Blades, so it was even harder to use. But if using them optimally, and just, you know, using them with normal enchantments like Voidstrike, Enchanting, Guarding Strike, and Leeching or Gravity, their optimal hits per second, damage per second was 2,305,895. And again, that's if you artifact cancel perfectly, so yeah, they weren't really that great unless you use them on those specific builds with those specific enchant combos and use them, you know, perfectly. So I had them ranked at B just because they had amazing potential, just not the easiest to use, and also they had, you know, really poor reach and area. Now, however, Broken Saw Blade has a combo of 21 and Mechanized Saw Blade has a combo of 31. The first hit of each of their combos has the same 345,078 damage, but the rest of them were reduced to 322,072 damage, so it seems like it got a bit of a nerf. However, if you're using them without any kind of tricks and just letting the weapon overheat and then cool down, you get 5.9 hits per second with Broken Saw Blade and 7 hits per second on Mechanized Saw Blade. Now, when I was measuring them with perfect artifact canceling, I wasn't able to get them both to the same hits per second. You could assume that's maybe just a little bit of human error because it's almost the same. I got 9.3 hits per second on Broken Saw Blade and 9.5 hits per second on Mechanized Saw Blade. That gave Broken Saw Blade 2,990,669 DPS without enchants, and Mechanized Saw Blade got 3,077,744 DPS. So again, you could assume that they're both 9.5. The biggest point here, though, is now not only including their broken use, like with certain enchant combos and builds, now if you're just using the weapon normally, it is ridiculously good with that kind of DPS. The only thing holding it back, really, is the reach and area. But even with that in mind, and just taking normal use into account, I can't justify giving the weapon lower than S tier. It is just, despite me not really liking them personally, it's just a really solid weapon now to use for pretty much anyone. Next then we have the Coral Blade line, which again is an interesting one because originally both Coral Blade and Sponge Striker had 6.4 hits per second, and their base top speed hits per second DPS was 1,374,176. Well, Sponge Striker was actually more like over 5 billion because of its effect dealing like 10 billion when it would trigger, but still, that's what they were at, and they had 2.7 blocks reach. Now, both of them were upgraded to have 3 blocks reach, but while Coral Blade was given 7.2 potential hits per second, Sponge Striker was given 7.7 hits per second. So now Coral Blade has 1,545,145 DPS, which, yes, if anyone's paying attention, that is more DPS than Bee Stinger and Rapier have at base top speed, which kind of irks me a little bit because I liked that they weren't the bottom barrel weapon for at least a little bit. But what are you gonna do? And then Sponge Striker has 1,645,479 potential top speed DPS, which again doesn't matter because the weapon's broken damage effect completely overshadows that. However, the weapon that got the most egregious boost that I don't understand why is the Cutlass line. For whatever reason, Mojang saw fit to give them a 50% damage boost, so they went from 383,419 damage per hit to 601,607. Like, I would have been fine with a 20%, maybe 25% damage boost, but they gave it a 50% boost for like no reason. I guess they figured that damage per hit originally was way too low, because Otherwise, if they thought that originally that was fine damage, giving a 50% boost for the type of sword that it is, which isn't particularly a heavy or hard-hitting weapon, it just didn't make too much sense. But you know what? Nameless Blade is one of my favorite weapons, so I'm not complaining. The way that this affected their DPS is originally, Cutlass and Nameless Blade had 2,108,805 DPS, and Sparkler and Dancer Sword, when you factor in Rampaging, had about 2,223,830 DPS. Now, however, Cutlass and Nameless Blade have 3,308,839 DPS, which easily bypasses the old Moon Daggers and things like, you know, Fighter's Bindings, Master's Katana, Starless Knight. And then we have a 3,489,320 base top speed DPS for Dancer Sword and Sparkler, which is almost as much as the beginning and the end. That's crazy. It actually surpasses the old Encrusted Anchor. But yeah, those ones got the biggest boost. It's crazy how it affected their placement in DPS tier rankings, and just their placement on just a weapon tier list in general. Next then we have the Dagger line, which in the patch notes it said that they all got a damage boost and also a reach boost. This only applied to normal daggers, at least for the reach. Originally, all of them had a 6-hit combo that did 268,394 damage. Now, however, the first 3 hits of their combo do 299,067 damage, and then the last 3 hits of the combo do what they did before. However, all of them used to have 2 blocks reach. Now regular daggers have 2.3 blocks reach, and the other 3 still have 2. So yeah, I'm pretty sure that was a mistake. They meant to do that for all of the weapons, and they just, I guess, forgot to. Anyway, for the DPS of Daggers and Fangs of Frost, it used to be 2,496,064. Now it's 2,638,692. In comparison then, Sheer Daggers have now 3,114,133 DPS, which really big because that's about like old Starless Knight's DPS, but keep in mind that about 500,000 of that is from swirling, which doesn't scale with things like crit or enchanting, strength potion boosts, stuff like that. So it's really good on paper, but it doesn't scale very well when you stack more damage buffs. Finally then we got Moon Daggers, which originally were 3,244,883 DPS, now are 3,430,300 DPS, and I know it's a pretty decent damage buff, but I don't think that this would be enough to bump them up from S to SS tier because, again, when you factor in like the weapon's reach and its area, it's still not the best combo, especially since the weapon has no knockback to their hits, so they can't keep mobs away from swarming you even a little bit. But this just solidifies them in S tier at least. You know, if anyone wants to put them in SS tier, I can understand that, but just personally, I don't think I could see myself being able to justify that, but we'll see when I actually redo my weapon tier list, which, you know, I haven't actually done for this video yet. But also, speaking of really fast weapons, next we have probably the number 2 weapon that people were wondering about, Fighter's Bindings. Now, if you're not aware, Mojang, for whatever reason, saw fit to nerf this weapon by nerfing the base speed of normal gauntlets, well, just the whole gauntlet line, by 25%. I'm not entirely sure why they bothered to do this, because yeah, Fighter's Bindings used to be the king weapon back when, you know, Shockwave went through walls and could block arrows, and back when Swirling triggered without having to hit mobs, and there were only 3 enchant slots, so that combo of damage was just better than anything that you could put on other weapons, on top of the fact that Fighter's Bindings had really good pushback and great healing with Radiance. But, you know, once they added more enchant slots, and they added things like, you know, the anchors, they added other weapons, they added Voidstrike, and things to help weapons get better physical synergy with their damage enchants, Fighter's Bindings just kind of started to drop off in their effectiveness. Now, people still praise them as the best because either they were not familiar with the new mechanic changes or the new weapons that surpassed them, or people were just new to the game and they saw old posts about Fighter's Bindings and were jumping on that bandwagon. Either way, it sparked a lot of hatred towards Fighter's Bindings and people then saying that they were overrated. But now, as people are, you know, more familiar with the game's mechanics, most people know that Fighter's Bindings aren't even in the top 10 anymore, but there are still people that are saying that the weapon sucks and that they're overrated, so ironically, I think the pendulum has swung the other way. I think Fighter's Bindings are underrated, especially now with their nerf. I think people are going to still be saying that, you know, they're overrated when, no, they're not. Originally, Fighter's Bindings had 15.1 hits per second with just a mushroom. Now that would be 12.7 hits per second. But on the bright side, it actually makes sense now to run it with Renegade Armor. because if you do that with a mushroom, it does have 14.5 hits per second, which is almost the same as what it used to have. Downside is that you could originally run this with, say, full metal armor or with Highland armor to get the 30% damage boost. So now if you want that speed boost as well, you have to run it with Renegade armor, which only has a 20% damage boost. Still though, it's not the biggest change. They went from 2,894,821 DPS to 2,777,107. Again, the biggest question that I have is just why? Especially when they didn't even hit the rest of the weapon line actually. If you're using gauntlets at least at plus 125% attack speed, they have the same hits per second that they usually did, so gauntlets and soul fists still would have 8.4 hits per second, and maulers about 8.8 hits per second because of rampaging. The only thing that changed is their base DPS, which wouldn't really matter because you would run them with some kind of attack speed. So for gauntlets, say, they went from 873,547 DPS to 871,014, so what is that? 2,000 DPS out of almost 900,000? That's almost no change at all. So yeah, people that were worrying about the other gauntlets being hit, they weren't hit at all. Next we have the mace weapon line, which, just like with Dagger and Bone Club, Mojang screwed up. So in the patch notes it said that they slowed them all down and gave them 25% more damage. This is only fully true for a mace. So originally all three weapons had 3.8 hits per second, with the first two hits of the combo doing 498,445 damage, and the final hit doing 1,073,575. With mace, the hit speed is now 3.5 hits per second, and the damage is 621,140 on the first two hits, and 1,341,968 on the final hit. Flail and Sun's Grace did not get a damage buff at all. In fact, they actually got faster. They're 4.1 hits per second now, which makes no sense. I have no idea how that happened. So all three originally had 2,622,589 damage per second. Now, Flail and Sun's Grace has 2,854,146 damage per second, while a mace has 3,039,107 damage per second. So, again, unironically, a rare version of the weapon is better than their unique versions. It's crazy. Especially, well, I'll get to that later. It's even more insane. Next then we have the Katana weapon line, which for some reason they thought needed another buff, so they went from 3.3 top hits per second to 4 hits per second. What this did for them was, for Katana and Dark Katana, they had 2,488,393 DPS, now they have 3,016,233, so just on DPS alone that puts them on par with a Battle Staff, but they have superior reach and superior area, so they're just better weapons now. And for Master's Katana, it's even crazier. Originally they had 2,986,072 DPS, which already was better than Fighter's Bindings was at their best. Now it's 3,618,481. That is, without exaggeration, the best base top speed hits per second without enchantments out of any weapon in the game. You know, unless you count Sponge Striker, which, again, numbers-wise, I don't. It's just ridiculous how much better they made these weapons. Like, Master's Katana is pretty much, I don't know if I would say exactly like top 3, because, you know, other weapons that were in the top 7 still exist, but I would have a hard time keeping it out of the top 7 now, just because of what it's capable of. Speaking of weapons that were in the top 7, we've got Obsidian Claymore and Starless Knight. Now the only change that happened with them was that they made them slower. So originally they had a top speed of 1.9 hits per second, now it's 1.7 hits per second. The way that this affected their DPS is originally it had 3,168,962, now it's 2,844,739, which kind of weird when looking at a weapon that's this big, because it puts it quite a bit below both Swift Striker and Beginning in the End. In fact, it's even lower than Backstabber and Void Touch Blades. It's just, again, I'm not sure why they felt the need to nerf it that much, but I guess it kind of makes sense because with its area and DPS boost from Voidstrike, it actually made it a really solid weapon. I would say more solid against groups than an Encrusted Anchor. Not as much as, like, say, a Cursed or a Double Axe or something like that, but still a really solid weapon. Just weird then seeing its DPS compared to other weapons with it being such a big sword. Next and finally we have the entire Soul Sight line, and originally they had a top speed of 3.5 hits per second, now it's 4.3 hits per second. And the way it's affected them is, and this is also how I can tell that my measurements are at least somewhat accurate, because Mojang likes to repeat a lot of number values in their stuff, because they use kind of like base values and just like up those. So, Soul Siphon, its entire line, had a base top speed hits per second, damage per second of 2,147,149, which was the old damage per hit of the anchors. Now, however, it's 2,666,000, knock on wood, 19 damage per second. So, already at base for melee, they're better than they used to be, but this makes it even better for soul builds. Like, the way it affected them is huge. So, for one thing, being able to land faster hits means you have more often Soul Siphon triggers, but also if you're using Voidstrike on the weapons, hitting faster against a mob that you have stun-locked with, say, Snowball, you're getting less damage per hit because you're hitting faster, so Voidstrike isn't multiplying those hits as much. So when you're hitting a stun-locked mob, you get to hit them more times before they die. So that already, just at base value, was more chances to trigger Soul Siphon. But on top of that, they buffed Soul Siphon to, instead of spawning 6 Soul Orbs at a 5% chance every hit, that each have your Soul Gathering value, now it spawns 5 Soul Orbs per trigger, but it's a 20% chance to trigger, so they did drop the amount of souls you get by 1/6, but they increased the trigger rate of it by 300%. So originally, Soul Siphon increased your Soul Gathering by roughly like 33% per second, per minute, whatever you want to measure. Now it is a 110% increase. Like, since this update, I've done a few Soul build runs just with my classic Soul build, and I recorded one of them, which I'll post sometime in the future. It's ridiculous. Even with Bag of Souls giving me 750 max souls instead of 599, and me spamming my souls, just a few attacks later against a group, I'm already at full souls again. It is crazy. Like, one group of enemies just with a scythe alone can get me a full soul meter just attacking them with melee. Like, before Daggers they had a niche with soul builds because their speed with a mushroom and Soul Siphon, even at 5%, would give you crazy soul gathering. But now with Soul Siphon being as good as it is, it's kind of overkill for Daggers because you only needed 5%, but for a scythe hitting that many enemies because of the wide swings, like if you're hitting 5 enemies at once, that's on average like 1 trigger per swing. It's crazy the amount of gathering that you get with it. It's basically what the old Daggers with Soul Siphon gathering used to be. It's crazy. Anyway, that covers all the weapons with their like individual stats, how they compared to what they were before. Again, I'll have this image posted on Reddit and linked down below. What I want to get into, though, more specifically, is how this affects stunning on the weapons. Because, like I said, some weapons got a speed change rather than a damage change, so this would affect things like Voidstrike and stunning. So the first one I want to go over, because it's kind of a throwaway one, is Obsidian Claymore and Starless Knight. They went from having a 46% chance to stunlock to now a 42.3% chance to stunlock. So they went from being awful at it to still awful at it. So yeah, nothing really new there. Another weapon that got a change, like I mentioned before, Katanas originally had a 65.7% chance to stunlock. Now they have a 72.8% chance to stunlock, so that's almost what I would call viable. If you remember in my video about stunning, I said that a 75% chance is what I would consider, you know, worthwhile investing in a stunlock build. So yeah, it's kind of funny to think that Katanas went from being so slow in the first versions of the game to almost being stunlock worthy. Then we've got maces, which originally were a 70.8% chance. Normal mace now is a 68% chance, while the other maces are 73.6% chance, so even closer to being what I would consider viable for stunlock. You might also see that I have the broken and mechanized saw blades on here. I would kind of disregard them on both sides. I didn't even bother to change them on the other side despite having more hits per second. That's because things like Radiance and Stunning, they don't work the same on saw blades. They don't trigger as often as they would on other weapons, as opposed to what their hits per second would suggest, and even Gravity was only triggering every other hit, so while their increased speed would make them better for running Stunning than it was before, they're still not worth investing in a full Stunlock build. Like, they run other things way better. What I would rather talk about actually though is the Scythe line. Like, this one's the most interesting to me because they used to be a 68% chance to stunlock, now they're a 75.2% chance to stunlock, which means that they are in range to be a legitimate stunlock weapon, which is just crazy to think about with how slow they used to be. In fact, actually, since stunning weapons prefer running things like Gravity with Stunning to group enemies into the hits, the fact that scythes have such a wide hit area means that you don't need to run Gravity with them, so it actually gives them an advantage. You could just run like, say, Guarding Strike or Weakening or something. It's crazy how much better they are with that, actually. For the Coral Blade and Sponge Striker line, they originally had an 87.5% chance to stunlock. Now Coral Blade has a 90.3% chance, so if you were running a stunlock build on it, that makes it even better. And with a Sponge Striker, it's a 91.8% chance. The one build that I suggest to run with a Sponge Striker because of the way that they changed it so that Pain Cycle no longer auto triggers the damage was Gravity, Swirling, Weakening, and Radiance. You know, you have Gravity to group enemies into the hits so that you're getting more of those insane damage hits on them. You have Weakening so you can affect all these mobs to drop their damage so that you can live hits to trigger that damage. And then you have Swirling to hit enemies around you since you can only do that billions of damage against one mob at a time. And then you had Radiance for healing. But since the weapon's even faster now, you could switch out Swirling for Stunning and just run a Stunlock build, which will hilariously one-shot a mob now and then if they manage to hit you. So yeah, that's something worth looking into. Finally then we have Fighter's Bindings. They went from a staggering 99.3% chance to Stunlock to the lowly 99.1% chance to Stunlock. Like, I don't even know how people would even bother running that build anymore. It's just garbage, it's F tier, like, just throw it away. No, like I said, it's crazy. They barely changed them at all. I don't know why they even bothered trying to nerf them. And next I'm going to go over what people probably wanted to see the most in this video, and that's how the Voidstrike boost is affected by the different speed changes of the weapons. And I want to start out hot and heavy by going over this change's biggest heavy hitters, the Katanas. So originally it was a 61.4% DPS boost on Katana and Dark Katana, and it got a 62.9% boost on Master's Katana. Now with them being faster though, it's a 50.7% DPS boost on the first two, and a 52.2% boost on Master's Katana. So yeah, it's not as crazy as it shows on their base top speed DPS. Like, yeah, it was a pretty big boost, but overall this kind of helps to balance things out, but still, they are better than they used to be, and it's just kind of hilarious to think how they went from, you know, being maybe top 10, top 15 weapons overall to easily, like, top 8 or 7, at least for Master's Katana. It's just, it's crazy how they changed that. Next then we've got the mace line. Originally, all three of them were a 51.4% DPS boost. Now, since a mace is slower, it gets a 55% DPS boost, which is just hilarious to me because not only does it have higher base top speed DPS than the other two, but it also gets a bigger Voidstrike DPS boost. It's just objectively a better weapon than its unique counterparts because, to be honest, like, level 1 chains and level 1 radiance on these weapons isn't that good, so yeah, it's probably going to be a meme for a while how Bone Club is better than Bone Cudgel and how Mace is better than Flail and Sun's Grace. But for Flail and Sun's Grace, despite the fact that they did get faster than they were before, they actually have a bigger Voidstrike DPS boost. It's the same as Master's Katana now at 52.2%. And originally, that didn't make sense to me. I was like, how did they get a bigger Voidstrike boost despite being faster than they were before? But then if you look at Battle Staff on both of these lists, both before and after the update, it has a higher Voidstrike boost than the Mace line and Flail and Sun's Grace on the right side, despite the fact that it's faster than both of them. So yeah, I guess that's Mojang just being consistent with being inconsistent. Then we've got the Soul Scythe line. It originally was sitting at 62.5% DPS boost. Now it's at a 55% DPS boost. And noticing a lot of weapons here have that Mace, the Double Axe line, the Axe line, the Pickaxe line, and now the Scythe line. But yeah, so this kind of helps balance things out. So they still do have a increased overall DPS boost of using them for melee. It's just not as crazy as like their base DPS boost is showing. But this really helps out soul builds because, like I said, you're landing faster hits, so each hit is getting less of a Voidstrike boost, so you can land more hits on the enemy. Like, yeah, you are overall killing them faster, but you're getting more chances to trigger Soul Siphon, which is just crazy, and in my book, just huge win for soul builds. I'm a big fan. Another one we have is the Sawblade line. Originally, they were sitting at a 40% DPS boost, which meant that it was more worth running over Crit, because Crit was a 40% DPS boost as well. It's just that with Voidstrike, you could multiply other damage on top of that, and you could also like delay your hits to get an even bigger hit like on the next attack. Now it's a 32.5% boost, so it's not worth running over Crit. So if you wanted to run like a traditional build, you'd run instead like Crit, Enchanting, Guarding Strike, and Leeching or Gravity. But it doesn't matter anyway, since most of the most broken builds use like Artifact Synergy and Dynamo, or it uses Pain Cycle, or it uses like Shockwave and Swirling. Just if you're thinking about running a physical one, it's only worth using Voidstrike over Sharpness, which isn't a huge win in any book. Next then we've got the Coral Blade and Sponge Striker line, which originally I did have a Coral Blade and Sponge Striker with Voidstrike to measure it out at 36.4%. Admittedly, I didn't keep them, and since I've been doing some PC smithing, I now have negative 1 billion enchantment points, which you'll probably see in like a soon upcoming video. So I don't have a way to enchant Voidstrike on them if I did find Voidstrike on, and also since the update, as far as I know, I can't use my PC smithing. because it's not updated, so I can't even give Voidstrike to any Coral Blades or Sponge Strikers that I have. So my only option would be, if I wanted to measure this accurately, to find one either from an Ancient or from the Piglin Merchant that happens to have a Tier 3 Voidstrike gilded on, which I'm not going to bother to do. So what I did was I used like the other weapons around them as a reference with their hits per second to get the approximate. Like Coral Blade is 7.2 and the Sickle Line is 7.1, so it would be about 35.2%, and then for Sponge Striker it would be at least 33.6%, if not more. All this basically means is that it's more worth running over Sharpness if you had that option, but not worth running over Crit or Committed. In fact, you know, like, for these weapons you would rather run like Exploding or Shockwave or Swirling or Thundering like on a Coral Blade, and you especially wouldn't want to be running physical damage on a Sponge Striker since its effect makes those kind of redundant. So yeah, even though it's not super accurate, I don't think that the Minecraft Dungeons police are going to come in and say, oh, we're gonna come and take you and lock you up for spreading false information, you're ruining lives here with this. No, this is only going to affect if you want to choose between Sharpness and Voidstrike, which I would rather pick Voidstrike. So yeah, that's all the biggest changes. Oh, actually I should mention as well, you probably noticed that there was a change to Vine Whip and Encrusted Anchor. This didn't come from the update, this is just me being more thorough and accurate with my measurements. So yeah, originally it said there was a 175% boost on the anchors and a 70% boost on the whips. This is accurate for the physical damage, however, if you're actually measuring the poison DPS as well, it's not the same. For a Vine Whip, you get 70% increased physical DPS with Voidstrike, but only a 37.9% increase to the poison DPS. So factoring all that in, it's actually just a 64.7% boost overall, which I know how I say it's just, but it's still a pretty good boost. It is lower than a Whip's boost, but keep in mind that a Vine Whip does have more base DPS, so overall it does have more DPS than a Whip. Especially if you just do one hit and let the poison climb, that's the most effective way to use it. For an Encrusted Anchor, you get 175% increased physical DPS, but just an 81% increase to the poison DPS. So overall, this gives it, if you're attacking constantly at 125% more speed, a 140.8% DPS boost, which again is massive considering that it has really high base DPS. And even higher if you're just landing like one hit and letting the poison climb. I just thought that I would clarify that, and I did change the other side of the list, and I would have changed the previous list, but it's obsolete now, but I'm going forward going to be reflecting all of that. The only other two left to go over would be Fighter's Bindings and the Obsidian Claymore and Starless Night line, and the reason I saved them for last is, despite the fact that all of them are slower than they used to be, Voidstrike is still the same boost that it used to be, so it's 25% on Fighter's Bindings and 100% on the other two, which I know it kind of sucks. I bet people were hoping that because Starless Night is slower that it would at least get a bigger Voidstrike boost to make up for it, but no, it's still the same boost, so it is just straight up a nerf to the weapon. The only thing that I have left to go over is how this affects the weapon's placement with their base DPS and also Enchanted. Because, as you know, I had like a tier listing for weapons with their base top speed DPS with no enchantments. We had originally a Sponge Striker still sitting at the top there with over 5 billion. But in second place it was beginning and the end at just 149 shy of 3.5 million. Now that it's solidly taken by Masters of Katana with over 3.6 million, so that jumped up 12 spots from where it was before, and beginning and the end dropped 1 spot. Below beginning and the end originally it was a Growing Staff at 3.416 million. Now below them is a Sparkler and Dancer Sword at 3.489 million, so that one actually jumped up 34 spots. In fourth place we originally had Encrusted Anchor, you know that DPS because I'd mentioned it already. Now though it's in 29th place, so it fell pretty hard in terms of just like, you know, base DPS. Other insane changes that I've noticed were like the Cutlass line. Originally they were like in, I think, if I'm looking here, 43rd place at 2.1 million. Now they're in 7th place at 3.3 million. That is a 36 jump in its tier listing placing. It's crazy. Then the Saw Blades originally were in 32nd place. Now they are in 19th and 16th place, so pretty solid jumps there. Then at the bottom you notice, before it was Coral Blade at the very bottom and Rapier and Beast Stinger just above it. Now those two switch places because Coral Blade just squeaked by in DPS, which, you know, I'm kind of sad about, but what can you really do? However, that was just base top speed unenchanted DPS listing. This here though is with enchantments, and this is why I didn't want to kind of go into it before, because I was going to touch on it here. So Encrusted Anchor was sitting at the top if you don't count Sponge Striker having over 5 billion DPS. Back when, Encrusted Anchor had its higher base DPS, and also when Enchanting affected the poison damage. Before, it was almost 40 million, it was 39 million and change, whereas beginning and the end we're sitting at just almost 21.5 million. After they nerfed it so that Enchanting wasn't affecting the poison, it was just 24 million and change for Encrusted Anchor. Now with the nerf to its base damage, it's sitting at 21,511,650, so it barely squeaks by beginning and the end, but again, keep in mind that this weapon has insane reach in area and really great defensive use of weakening, so it's still a really solid weapon. Things that are kind of funny though are seeing how Bone Cudgel is quite a bit below Bone Club. It looks like it's like anywhere from 15 to 20 places down just because they kind of messed up, and how much higher like Nameless Blade and Dancer's Sword jump. And like I don't have the place numbers here on this list that you probably can't even read because it's so small on the screen, but again, I'm going to include a link to these lists as well, just having them side by side to compare them. Other changes that were pretty big, like again, the Saw Blade line. This is just again going over a format of crit, Enchanting, Guarding Strike, leeching with things like Cowardice and either Renegade or Highland Armor for damage boosts. So this isn't going over like if you're using things like Dynamo and Artifact Synergy, because those use more specific builds, and it's a bit harder to calculate unless you're actually counting the numbers, because if you use them with certain exploits, you can hit easily like billions of DPS. It's about the same as Sponge Striker, it's crazy. The only other one that I really wanted to go over is, even though Coral Blade was higher than Rapier and Beast Stinger unenchanted, when you include enchants going over like a format of Enchanting, Gravity, Radiance, and then the Rapier and Beast Stinger having Thundering and Coral Blade having Swirling, you get slightly more damage for Beast Stinger and Rapier because Thundering's a bigger boost. They're sitting at 6,610,287 DPS against enchanted mobs, with Coral Blade having 6,415,442, so it's a little bit higher, but again, their strength isn't their DPS, it's their reach and insane use of things like Gravity and Stunning, which, yeah, admittedly it does help with Coral Blade as well, but its reach isn't as good to be keeping mobs away with or without Stunning, and the speed still isn't quite as high as, what Rapier and Beast Stinger are. So this is how the DPS tier listing is affected for all the weapons, and also how Stunning and Voidstrike is affected on these weapons that were changed, and just how the weapons compare to each other before the update versus after. That's pretty much what I wanted to go over with this video. I do have other videos planned for the future, like different runs that have different builds that I could do for giveaways. I'm just not entirely sure when I'll be able to get to uploading those videos or even editing them together. I just wanted to let you know that I do plan on doing that. It's just, if you've seen from my Minecraft Dungeons Mega Guide video, things have been kind of stressful here. My father recently passed away, and not only did that come with a lot of emotional stress and strain, but after that came financial stress and strain, because my mom is disabled. She has multiple sclerosis, so she can't do much for herself, and right now actually she's in the hospital because of her MS and her balance being bad. She fell and she broke her heel into 3 pieces, so she's not doing anything for a while, but she can't provide for herself. And originally we thought that my dad had taken out a $100,000 life insurance policy for her, but what we found out while he was in the hospital was that he was suffering actually from severe dementia, which we didn't notice before because he was on a routine with the house and at work, so he was able to function pretty much normally. He was just kind of forgetful here and there a lot, but we really noticed it when he was in the hospital. But what I think happened was that he believed he took out the life insurance policy for her, but he only remembered himself doing it because of that dementia, so he never bothered to actually do it because he thought he'd already done it. So she wasn't left with much. After my dad passed away, I stepped up and I went to paying for the mortgage for the house, for the lot rent, and other things like that, just so she didn't have to worry about it. And it's taken a lot out of me, like time-wise and energy-wise, I don't have a lot compared to what I did before. So for like editing videos together and stuff, it's made it more difficult because I've been spending a lot of time, like say playing Saints Row or making videos like this and calculating stuff like this. Plus, since I do giveaways with my videos, I don't like to often upload new videos until I'm almost caught up with giveaways that I owe people from previous videos. And it can be kind of hard because not only do those people need to be available for gifting, but I also have to be available at the same time to gift to them, and also have the energy on top of it. So it can be kind of rough balancing that. I'm thinking maybe like reducing the amount of gifting that I do per video, but I still definitely do want to do this gifting for the videos that I do, because I like giving back to the community. Like, you guys are what make my channel and any channel what it is. Like, if a channel doesn't have viewers, you're just throwing stuff against a wall and hoping people hear it. You know, so I like showing that appreciation for the people that support and that actually watch me, because aside from videos like this, which are not a good example of me not talking, I don't talk a lot in my videos. They're just to show how the builds that I use perform and, you know, just advertise and see if people want to use those for themselves. But also, it's just because, like, I'm able to get these things by using a table online so I can edit my items, and not everyone has access to that, so I like being able to give to people that might not be able to get those items themselves, because the RNG in this game is just brutal. Like, it is ridiculous how much everything relies on RNG. But for this video, that's all I wanted to go over, so until next time.